It's always wonderful for me to come back to Fort Santiago. It's one of my favorite places in the world, and it's one of the most beautiful. It's a beautiful park, beautiful ruins, and a really nice place to be. You can hear birds chirping. The problem, and the only problem for me, is that it contains a lot of memories that are not so beautiful. Anybody who would have visited here anytime between 1942 and February 1945 would have heard nothing but human beings screaming. The Japanese were torturing hundreds, maybe thousands of people in here, largely civilians, many of them innocent as well, of any crime. But they had a lot of guerrillas and a lot of underground resistance people here, and beat the hell out of them. Just tortured them in inhuman ways. As a matter of fact, right where we are now, this was one of the locations of torture cells. And my father was in here for a few days in 1942. My grandmother was in here for a few months in 44 until they killed her. They executed my grandmother, and they executed a lot of the people who were in my father's intelligence net during the war. When I started making the video on the secret war in the Pacific, which is a story about my father, Chick Parsons, and his role in the Philippines during the war, I didn't know where it was going to lead me, or I didn't know anything about it, because my partner at that time was Morgan Cavett, and he was doing some videos for my brother up in Baguio about how to make handmade paper. It was his idea to start working on the life of my father. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I thought, oh my God, it's going to be so complicated, and I don't know anything about my father's life. He never told us much. So Morgan and I started doing research, and we went to national archives in the States and in the Philippines. We went to every public library that felt relevant, including the Chattanooga Library, where my father had a lot of stuff. He was born in Shelbyville near Chattanooga, but our travels took us really literally all around the world, and we got to meet hundreds of people who either knew my father or knew about him or were part of his work in the Philippines, both militarily and in business. And even it took us to Japan, where my father had possibly more friends than he had in the States. Morgan Cavett got me started on this project, and his forte was music. He had early in his career, he'd produced some wonderful music, and he'd gotten, I don't know, he'd gotten those plaques that they make of the records, gold, silver, platinum, I forget exactly what. And he was a little bit of a showman himself. His dad had won 2 Oscars in Hollywood, one for Going My Way, and the other one was for The Greatest Show on Earth, the circus movie. The first one was a Bing Crosby movie. And so when we were making this, when we were doing research and doing work in his studio in the desert in Southern California, we had these Oscars staring at us. It was quite an inspiration to have, you know, to be able to actually touch an Oscar while we're working on, you know, a movie or a video project of our own. Turned out that Morgan was the one who first got interested in this pretty interesting story. He never even knew my father, but only by hearsay. So he interviewed Michael, then he interviewed me, he interviewed my other brother Joe, other brother Patrick, and then he got me into the project. It's been about 10 years that we've been pursuing this. Lots of research, hundreds of interviews, lots of hours of videotape and oral tape. There's a lot of stuff we didn't know. I didn't know that my father had an oral history at the Naval Institute. So we got that, we got the tapes, the audio tapes, and we found people like one of my dad's Navy bosses during the war was Captain Arthur McCollum, now Admiral, or when he made his oral history, he was Admiral McCollum, and he had some neat things to say corroborating my dad's efforts from Australia working with MacArthur. So we found stuff in Annapolis, that's where the U.S. Naval Institute is. We also found things in Columbia University. There's an oral history there that pertains to my father. All the military libraries like Carlisle Barracks and the MacArthur Memorial at Norfolk, Virginia, they've got tons of guerrilla information and a lot of references to my father's work in them. So we spent days at Carlisle, more days at MacArthur Memorial, and then the National Archives is a great place to go and just live. And I tell you, once you start doing research, it's fabulous. I guess it's addictive, because I think about 10 years ago, once I got involved in this, or hooked in it, I quit writing what I was doing then. It was short stories, novels, and things like that. But now I spend most of my time in research and history. And one of the things we've been researching a lot are the archival boxes of my father. He collected everything from movie stubs, you know, tickets to theaters, airplane tickets, things like that, everything. And hotel bills. And he put them in scrapbooks. And the scrapbooks had been subjected to flooding, and we've been able to put them into boxes now. And the boxes are now indexed. I have an annotated index. This has taken about 5 years just to do that. Eventually all of this stuff will end up at the MacArthur Memorial. They've been so helpful. James Obel at the MacArthur Memorial has been more than helpful. Bob Lapham, the guerrilla from Luzon, one of the guerrillas in Luzon, was one of my favorite interviews. And one of the reasons was that he was such a cool guy, and he had presented me with a very special gift when we interviewed him. A pair of pristine Navy binoculars. And on the leather case for the binoculars was C. Parsons, USN. When my father came to Luzon in 1944, I think it was July or August, for a dropping of guerrilla supplies near Valor, one of the guerrillas to meet him was Bob Lapham. And he and my father apparently got along quite well, because in addition to the binoculars, my father gave Lapham a crate of whiskey. Lapham said, I asked him where the whiskey was. He said, oh no, that didn't last a week. But the binoculars he took back with him, took care of them in the States. He went to see many football games and things like that. But he was very happy to give me those binoculars, and those now reside in the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. Another of my favorite characters that we came across very early on, not a guerrilla, but a writer. His name was Bill Weiss. And if you look in the, if you watch the video, you'll see this guy saying about my father when my father was about to go back on mission, on guerrilla mission into the Philippines by submarine. Bill Weiss is there saying, he was too old. He was old. And Bill Weiss knew my father by correspondence. Bill Weiss was writing a book called Secret Mission to the Philippines. Incidentally, that's not the secret mission to the Philippines written by Galang, one of the guerrillas who went in with my father in 1944. But it was a book for young adults. And Bill Weiss met us in New York. Very interesting guy, wonderful guy, loved my father. And a lot of his old records, however, were gone, so we had to talk with him. We had to get it all orally. And he was very forthcoming. Wonderful. He even told us about the time my father was invited down to Cuba by Fidel Castro to observe the guerrilla movement before they became leaders. And he wanted my father to sign on as his guerrilla coordinator. My father would have been the Che Guevara, Che Parsons of Cuba. I thought that was a pretty interesting story. Webb Jennings was somebody I never thought we would ever find. I was reading in the letters that my father wrote to my mother, Katsi, during the war. When he was in Australia, when he was in the submarines, when he was in the Philippines, he wrote a letter home nearly every day. And most of them, believe it or not, are typewritten. And in it, in one of these letters, was the mention of my best aide, Webb Jennings. I said, wow, maybe we can find him. So Morgan, who's pretty good, who unfortunately Morgan at this point is dead. He died before the project was finished. He died in December of 2004, bless him. But this was back in 1996 or so, and Morgan got on the internet, made one or two stabs at locating Webb Jennings, and the first telephone call he made was to a son. He was just amazing. The stories he told about my father, and we didn't know, for instance, that my father was called El Chico during the war. But once we found that out from Jennings, everywhere we went and looked and saw there was a reference to Chico, and that was my dad. So he also told about my dad flipping a coin, always flipping a coin. And I remember that. My dad flipped a coin a lot, and it always came up the way he wanted it. Heads, 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 all the time. The head of the Allied Intelligence Bureau wrote a book called The AIB Story. And he had a chapter on my father in which he said, no, Chick Parsons was cheating. He flipped it off center so it wobbled. But I asked my dad, I said, did he get you right? Is that how you got the heads all the time, or tails? He said, no, he doesn't know what he's talking about. You have to flip it right. And he showed me. He flipped it, and it turned end over end. And it was not as it's written in the AIB story. He really flipped his coin. But Webb Jennings told us also, and confirmed something that we had not known about previously, was that my father had these 4 gunboats towards the end of the war that were given to him by the Navy, 2 LCSs, the 9 and the 10, and 2 LCIs, the 362 and the 363. And they went up and down like pirates, fighting the Japanese. It was terrific. Webb Jennings accompanied the boats a lot, and my father accompanied the boats on their first few missions. So Webb was actually telling us, he said they showed movies when they came into towns in the provinces, and then when they left, he said they converted the gunboats into zoos. There was snakes and pythons, parrots and monkeys and ferns, palm trees. It was wonderful. And what they did was they left behind sacks of flour and rice and milk, powdered milk. So I think not only were they harassing the Japanese, but they were building goodwill all along the coast of Mindanao and in the other Visayan islands. Morgan and I traveled a lot all over the world, but our most enjoyable trips were right here in the Philippines. And one of our first trips, we went by ferry boat to Leyte, to Maasin, and our project took us to Malitbog. Both of those places were scenes of the first gunboat action that the guerrillas undertook in their offensive against the Japanese. It was October 23rd and 24th, 1944. So we get to Malitbog and we're looking for guerrillas, and we're looking for people who might have remembered the gunboat coming to town. It was a big deal. We were even looking for the pier, or the remains of the pier, where the mayor of the town had been so thrilled with my father's presence and the gunboats cleaning out the Japanese that he held a fiesta on the pier. But when he went to the end of the pier to greet the people off the gunboat, he fell through the floor. The pier, in the credit, when we roll the credits on our video, you'll see the remains of the pier, those sticks that are coming out of the water. That's the Malitbog, the famous Malitbog pier. Well, we found a woman related to the Escaño family, and that was the great guerrilla leader of Malitbog, one of the best in Leyte. And she was telling us about when they had to flee up into the mountains, and they were looking down onto the gunboat action. The gunboats came in and pounded the Japanese garrison. And she was wonderful because she told us that she came down from, she looked down and she could see the Japanese running, and then she started laughing, a spontaneous burst of laughter. And people wanted us to cut that out of the video, but I insisted on putting it back in because I figured 4.5 years of being beaten up by the Japanese, controlled by them. Everything in your life was controlled by them. You had no freedom. And all of a sudden, she gets to tell me the Japanese were running. And for her to see that and to feel that joy 50, 60 years later, it's not fair of me not to put that in. So it's not that it's anti-Japanese. I'm not trying to make this an anti-Japanese movie. I'm trying to make it factual. But this is a chance for this woman, from my point of view, to express what the whole Philippines was feeling, the joy of liberation. In the Philippines was not where we met one of our best Filipino interviews. He was actually in Seattle. And Bill Neri had been a secretary to Father Haggerty, the famous guerrilla padre of Mindanao. And when the war came out, and he wanted to join the guerrillas, but he felt loyal to Father Haggerty. Father Haggerty said, no, 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 you go and you be the secretary there. And guess what? He is the only person we encountered in 10 years who could translate the shorthand notes of my father. My father made guerrilla notebooks in handwriting, just little ones. He carried with him in his pocket, and he did them in shorthand. It's so frustrating for me because I don't know anything about shorthand, and this was an old form of Gregg shorthand, not a modern one. So the modern teachers of Gregg don't know what it says. Bill Neri knew, so I sent him copies, and he's such a sweetheart. He was writing me, up until his death, the translation from my dad's notebooks. And prior to that, I would see these notebooks because he got into the Philippines very early in '43, and I'm sure he came to Manila. And there's Laurel, Vargas, Aquino, all in normal language, and then Greg. Couldn't understand a word. Every now and then he would say, totally okay. That was like on the Roses family, for instance. Okay. And you must remember that most of these people who were being talked about, they were now in the collaborationist government, the puppet government. And they were all my father's best friends. So for him to have anything bad to say about them would have been very, very, very strong. And he pronounced that Laurel was okay, and he wrote this in a report to MacArthur. And MacArthur, I have this in the archives, the Parsons archives, in the margin, in MacArthur's handwriting, it said, I never made those statements to Laurel. That's total bullshit. That's MacArthur. So that was one of the only corrections to my father's reporting from MacArthur, was that Laurel was not okay, according to MacArthur. Bill Neri was also the one who told us how my father got around in Mindanao. He said Father Haggerty had 2 horses, and he gave one of them to Commander Parsons. And Now I see pictures of people on horseback going around Mindanao during the war, and every now and then I can spot my father. He was riding a horse called Alibaba. And it was also Neri who told us that when my father came back on his second and subsequent trips by submarine, one of the things he brought into the islands for the guerrillas was mass wine and flour for mass communion wafers. And the Columban priests and the Jesuit priests were overjoyed with this detail. When I was talking to Mario Mendisona, who is also in our books and one of the family members of the great Osamis Mendisona clan of Mindanao, big guerrilla, wonderful guerrilla supporters and patriots, he was telling me that he was in the house in Jimenez, that's about 30 kilometers south of Oroquieta in Mindanao. And my dad had been so sick and tired of fleeing to the hills every other day with a false alarm about Japanese patrols coming, that this time he slept through the warning. He said, "Oh, it's just another false alarm." And Mario also stayed behind. Mario at that time was about 12 years old. And my dad wakes up to the pounding on the door and the shouts of the Japanese patrol down below in the street, and he looks out. Wow, 20 or 30 Japanese. So he picks up his bag full of information and documents, and he's in his underpants. So he runs out of the house, down the stairs. There's the Japanese coming up just as he's going down. And the Japanese was staring at this crazy white man going by in a beard and underpants. What? And they didn't shoot or anything. And my father got to the fence. I've slept in that room where he was, and I went down those stairs and I went to the fence where he jumped over. The fence is this high. My dad's my height and a little bit shorter, maybe about an inch. And he just flew over the fence. Adrenaline boost. Anyway, he gets up in the hills and he meets the priest of the town, and the priest says, "Ay, ay, ay, I forgot to bring the wafers and the wine." My dad says, "No problem. The Japs are still down in the Osami's house." So he runs back down. Again, he's still in his underpants, right? He runs down to the church, which is at the top of the hill, and he goes into the church. He goes in where there's the wine and the wafers and this stuff. He gets it all. And just as he's coming out, the Japanese are the same guys again. They're coming in the front door of the church and they're saying, "My God, this guy again." But my father had been a champion runner during high school. So he had no problem outrunning these guys. They had, guns and equipment and bullets. He just had wafers and wine up in the hills. No problem. But that was his dedication to things of the church. And later he was made a papal knight, St. Sylvester Knight. And I think that's only appropriate because he really thought about the church a lot. My father was involved with priests in many ways. First of all, he was friends with many of them, including, as I've said before, Father Haggerty, Edward Haggerty. And also in Manila, one of his great friends was Father, I think his name's John Hurley. He was with Ateneo. Well, both of those guys were Ateneo, they're Jesuits. And when I talked to Father Reuter, we interviewed him, he said he was under the impression that my father got his priest, we'll call them costumes, from Father Hurley. That was a possibility, but we also know from Bill Andrews, who's in the video, and a polo playing friend of my dad before the war, that my dad was going around in the disguise of a priest even before he escaped from the Philippines and came back. But the part that interests me is the part when he came back, because I have talked to several people who said they either talked to my father or they saw him in Manila going around dressed as a priest during the war. This does not appear in any official document at General MacArthur's headquarters or in the Allied Intelligence Bureau. He worked for both at one time, or in any other place. And my father never admitted it to me or told me anything about it. But there's a letter from a prisoner in Santo Tomas, a Mrs. Davies, and she wrote to Father Hurley and said, one of the most interesting things for me was when I was in the bus and I was going to Philippine General Hospital, I looked out the window and there was this bearded Spanish priest, and he calls up to me and he says, "Hi, Mary," and it was Chick Parsons during the war, right? Now, when I talked to Nene Montalban down in Oroquieta, he said, yeah, your father came here and he told us that when he was in Manila, he confessed Manoling Rojas. So my father, Manoling Rojas was under Kempitay control and observation. And my dad was able to go in and sit in the confessional booth, and there was Rojas confessing all of his sins, quote, sins, unquote, to my father. And this was guerrilla information. So it was about troop locations, it was about who was who, the status of the puppet government, who was in Fort Santiago, who was being tortured. That kind of stuff was being told to my father by the source, Rojas. And after the war, my father said about Rojas, he said, you know, people think that he was a collaborator, but he said, I was in a position to know that he was not. So that was pretty interesting. Another person who saw him as, in the Philippines as a priest was Jose Mari Osamis, his father, who was my father's agent number 1 in the Manila Intelligence Net, or group. They call it MIG, Manila Intelligence Group. And he was caught in early '44, tortured in this place where we are, that's Fort Santiago, and killed later. Same day, but in a different grave by about maybe 3 or 4 meters from my grandmother. But it's also reported from one of my uncles, this would be Cecil, who was imprisoned in Santo Tomas, Bob Cecil, I think his name. He writes in his diary that the reports are coming to him that my father, in a priest outfit, went to the convent where the Immaculate Conception Sisters, where my grandmother was seeking refuge, and visited her there. So that's, if that's true, that's also very interesting corroboration. We have another sighting by Don Juan Rocha, the former ambassador to Spain from Manila. He told me he was walking down what is now Adriatico Street, but then was Dakota, near the Malati Church. He was holding the hand of his father, and comes by them a guy on a bicycle. It turns out it's a priest. But when the bicycle passes by the Rochas, that's the father and the son, boom, he drops a little pasalubong on the floor right by their feet. And it turns out the priest turns around when he's about 5-10 meters away and waves at them. It's my father. And Mr. Rocha told Johnny, he said, don't you tell anybody, this is very, very secret. That was Chick Parsons. And what he had dropped was a Life magazine and some MacArthur I Shall Return chocolates. Unforgettable memory, no? So I think my father getting around Manila as a priest was one thing. He also got around Manila, I know, not dressed as a priest. So this comes from the bartender at the Tsubaki Club, the one run by High Pockets on the Luneta, catered to high-ranking Japanese. Mamerto was the bartender there. And he knew my father before the war from the polo playing, because he was out at the military base where the Manila polo players would go and play. He said, I knew your father very well. And I even worked for your father after the war. He worked in Luzon Stevedoring. And he said, That was your father. I saw him on Rizal Avenue, which means that my father might have been visiting my grandmother and had his priest suit wrapped up somewhere, but it also means he was walking around without disguise in a place where millions of people would have known him or of him. He had a hat, he was walking in normal short pants, and he was within a few meters of the Japanese Kempetai office. Nice, huh? I must say that one of the greatest inspirations for me to get involved in this project on my dad's life was the whole spirit behind the American guerrillas of Mindanao. And there aren't too many of them left, but they are one of the finest group of guys that you will ever want to meet in your life. And these guys were not all sailors, they were not all military, they were not even they weren't from any particular branch of the service. There was Air Force, Marines, Navy, and even civilians that became part of the outfit of the 10th Military District, which was Mindanao, under eventually Wendell Fertig. I met some of this group in California about 25 years ago, and at that time one of my heroes, Sam Wilson, was still alive. The guy sitting at the head of the table, and there were about 25 guerrillas from Mindanao, tough-looking guy still 30 years ago. And when he saw me come in, and my friend Bob Merchant, who was incidentally our first interviewee on this project, when Bob Merchant introduced me, this guy got up, grabbed me, gave me a big kiss, and sat me down on his lap at the head of the table, and he said, "That's what I used to do to you in 1940. That was Sam Wilson, the way he greeted me. But those guys were forthcoming. They gave me information, pictures, leads to other people who might be able to give me information, and all of them had nice things to say about my father. One of them even called him lovable. And another guy said, "I was always puzzled." This was Doc Evans. He said, "I was puzzled by the appearance of your father occasionally from time to time among us, and he was doing what seemed to be military actions, but he was never dressed as a military, and he did not seem to observe military protocol." We always hear about the 30 or so civilian people that came out along with Mary Mackay and the Kreitzer, Mrs. Kreitzer and Stevie and the Birchfields out of Nasipit in November 1943. And we don't hear about the 30 military guys that went out at the same time. But the 10 people who had just escaped from Davao Penal Colony, they were on board. And General Schaffner, the most decorated Marine general during World War II, we interviewed him. He turns out to be a cousin. He said, "You know, we're kin." He told that to my father when they arrived, and my father said, I know, we're cousins." But the American guerrillas, the Philippine guerrillas of Mindanao were just super. Any guerrilla that I interviewed was, well, I can tell that they were great people back then because they're still great people now. One half of the picture in the Philippines, from the point of view of this story on my father, was the guerrillas and the people on the land receiving the aid coming from MacArthur's direction. The other half was the guys delivering it, the guys in the submarines. And I got acquainted with, very intimately with this aspect of it through what is known as the Stingray Foundation. Stingray was one of the submarines that was involved on the special missions. And one of the spark plugs of that organization in the States, and stateside part, is Ed Dolinar, who's been a big supporter and a big backer and a big helper in all of this. And in the Philippines, there's, Paul Bautista's not in the Philippines, he's a Filipino, but he lives in Australia, and Lucky Guillermo, who's helping me finish the technical aspect of this video. And With both of those, I was able to attend submarine meetings, submarine veteran meetings in the United States on 2 occasions, once in Houston and once in Georgia. And boy, to meet the submariners, you think the guerrillas were great people. Oh, the submariners, I can't tell you enough about them. One of the longest time people that we've known has been Bill Asbell, who was a big supporter of my dad, and he was an engine room crewman on the Narwhal. But all of these submariners, and they start telling stories. It was nothing. It's like just another piece of work. You know, we go to work, punch in, do this, punch out, go home. It's just incredible, the amount of bravery under stress and under nighttime, under difficult conditions. You can't capture it in a video, you can't capture it in an interview, but you can sense it when you meet these guys. You shake their hands and the energy comes through. Wow, you know, I'm shaking the hand here of somebody who's really important in my life and really important in the life of the Filipinos. It's been so gratifying to get the support in the Philippines and to see this effort to make the handshake between these guys and the local Philippine population. Wow. It makes your hair stand on end, and not out of fear. It's been a real pleasure, a real eye-opening experience, meeting all of these people on both sides of this equation, the delivery and the receiving end of it. Fabulous. So John Anderson came to Moon River, which is Morgan's studio in Southern California, and he got into Morgan's computer and eventually was able to extract what was a master of the program. It was at that point still an hour and 10 minutes long, although Morgan and I had been talking about cutting it down to about 50 minutes. Because when you show it and people start to go to sleep, you think, well, it's too long, no? So we thought, we'll cut it. But Morgan hadn't done it yet, and after a few conversations with John Anderson, it got to be so that he trusted me and I trusted him, and we communicated daily, even 2 or 3 times a day on email, rewriting some of the script, repositioning some of the scenes, and cutting stuff. By the time I got to LA, which was at the end of, I believe it was the end of February 2005, John Anderson had already cut it down to about 50 minutes, but he needed more stuff. And when I got there, we worked, for a week solid, very hard, and I had my Bibles with me, which were the handwritten notes of all of the tapes that Morgan had given me copies of, with time codes. So we used the Bibles to find more pictures to put in, more visual things, different visual things. And it was John Anderson, bless him, and his company is Information Programs. It was John who got me to tell more things. Because I was thinking, wow, we're cutting stuff. How are we going to add anything? So he wanted me to add the story about the diaper bag during the war when our family was leaving the Philippines under diplomatic, really sort of a bogus diplomatic status. The Japanese had let us go from Manila, but my mother had kept all of the information that my father had been gathering from guerrilla sources. She kept it hidden upstairs in the attic. There's no attic really, but upstairs above the ceiling. And when we got to the boat where we were leaving, there was an inspection. We all allowed one bag, but we had this extra diaper bag for my little brother Patrick, who was 1 year old at that time. And when we got to the inspection table, my father said, you take this bag, go over there and sit down and don't talk to anybody. And don't let go of your bag. So I had a reputation back then anyway for doing what I was told and being pretty straight. I guess things change, but I got to the edge of the pier where there was a bollard, and I was just sitting next to the bollard, and the next thing my father looks over, a Japanese has me on his lap, you know, bouncing me as if I were his kid, and he's giving me sweets. And the next thing you know, we're on the boat and we're out, safe. But all of that stuff would have meant probably pretty quick execution for my mother and father, and who knows what would have happened to us kids. It was still not entirely finished. There was still a lot of input from me still to go into it, but I had to get back to the Philippines, and that's where I came across an old friend of mine, Lucky Guillermo, who is at AV Manila. We had some difficulties with the tapes that we had gotten from the States because the tracks were already fused together and there was no editing the visual or the oral or the subtitles without just hacking into it like with a hacksaw. So we found material. Lucky and his crew were able to put something together which really I'm very happy to see. I think it's a remarkable piece of work. And it's a lot different from what Morgan and I would have ended up with. And actually I'm happy that we've ended up with this product because it does contain a lot more minutiae, the details, the emotional details that cling to this story for me. And as we talk now, I think it's finished.
Before World War II, the Philippines was a haven for Americans. Swimming, sailing, playing polo, they enjoyed the good life. But the Japanese fiercely attacked Manila just after Pearl Harbor. The U.S. and Philippine forces were eventually defeated. General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to leave the islands and uttered his famous promise, "I shall return." This is the story of how he was able to do so. American and Filipino troops were imprisoned and subjected to brutal conditions, but a few refused to surrender and escaped to the hills and jungles. During these highly dangerous years, the irregulars were contacted, supplied, and kept informed by a single U.S. Naval Reserve officer, having engineered a nearly unbelievable escape for himself and his family. When MacArthur finally returned, these guerrilla forces had been organized into military units, guiding U.S. warships, planes, and soldiers to their targets. The man that coordinated the resistance operation for the general was one Charles "Chick" Parsons. General MacArthur called him the bravest man I know.
Young Charlie's mother, Etta Searcy, had a brother, Moody, living in the Philippines. He had gone there with the Army and remained to work in the civil government as a prison guard. Another brother, Oscar, was persuaded to make his life there too, and in 1906 took young Charles Parsons with him to Manila.
A few years later, Chick was returned to the U.S., but the Spanish language and the love of Manila was deep inside him.
Even at an early age, he showed signs of great industry. By the time he was in his teens, he was often working at 3 different jobs. By 1920, Chick Parsons had graduated from high school and had already worked as a master stenographer at the DuPont Engineering Company in Delaware. To earn extra money, he also sold pills guaranteed to ward off the evils of the Halley's Comet. He then set off with a friend as a hired hand on a tramp steamer that was going to the Far East. When the ship arrived in the Philippines, Parsons decided that he had arrived home. He remained behind when the ship and his friend left Manila.
I gather he was quite young, and he was on board a ship, and I guess jumped ship here, and which sounds likely. And he came up with this job of being the personal secretary to General Wood. And General Wood, I think, was rather new here in his capacity as Governor General of the islands, and the islands had not been appropriately assayed or the coastline worked out for maps and that sort of thing. So that was Chick's initial job, which was marvelous because he really learned the Philippine Islands, more so than most Filipinos.
About 1920, as soon as the Wood Forbes mission came out, I got a job at Malacanang as a stenographer. Whenever the general went out anywhere, where he usually had his son, who was the second lieutenant in the Army, as his aide, he would take me with him. A very fortunate arrangement for me because it put me much closer to the Wood family that I moved into and lived in Malacanang with the Woods.
After 3 years working for Leonard Wood, and upon the recommendation of the Governor General himself, Parsons tendered his resignation to seek employment in the private sector. He spent the next 3 years working for the telephone company, living in the YMCA, and taking night courses in commerce at the University of the Philippines. Parsons, having advanced as far as possible with the telephone company in Manila, started looking for more exciting worlds to conquer. He had become acquainted, through mutual friends, with 2 men from California who were building a lumber mill in Mindanao in order to export product to the United States.
My next move was to go down to Zamboanga and build a new sawmill under proper technical people up at Panabutan Bay, 60 miles from Zamboanga. And that's where I met my wife and married her there at the time.
The happiest years that they spent together were the years that they spent in Zamboanga after they got married.
8/28, 29 crash came, and my army all went broke, and I took my savings and paid the last payroll at the mill so that the fellows would be paid to date. I hit my personal savings a little bit, but that was all right.
Making friends with the people of Mindanao and learning about life in the jungle would become all important in his role as guerrilla coordinator 10 years later.
The decade between 1930 and 1940 was a most exciting time in the Philippines. Elections were held for the first Commonwealth. Manuel Quezon and Sergio Osmeña became its first president and vice president. Full independence was promised soon. Economic ties between the Commonwealth and the mother country were solidified. General Douglas MacArthur was hired by Quezon to be Field Marshal of the Philippine Commonwealth Army. A young major, Dwight D. Eisenhower, was MacArthur's aide. It was the last decade before World War II. The Philippines was America's oyster, and Manila was truly the pearl of the Orient.
Chick moved back to Manila and found exactly the skills and connections he would need for the coming guerrilla war. He joined one of the largest ship handling agencies, which taught him to organize the activities of thousands of men.
17 labor unions, and we had a labor pool together with the permanent people we had there of over 20,000 people. I'd go every morning to the labor hall where you're sending out your gangs for the day to the different ships and all, and there'd be 2,000 or 3,000, 4,000 people going out in the morning, and the tugboat crews and the barge crews and all.
He would be at the waterfront at 4 o'clock in the morning, practically on a daily routine basis. That made him a very successful businessman. After all, he handled the waterfront for the Philippine Ports Terminal and Luzon stevedoring. At 4 o'clock in the morning, he'd see a lot of distributors there playing dice, rolling the dice and have coffee. He'd join them.
He was put in charge of the Panamanian consul because he handled all the ships of Panamanian registry. This chance connection to Panama would prove essential to his daring plan for his family's escape. He joined the U.S. Naval Reserve. He was assigned to Submarine Squadron 4 at Cavite. Submarines were how the guerrillas would eventually be supplied. General Wood had taught him to ride and value horses. Now his life revolved around riding at the Manila Polo Club. Horsemanship would also become a needed skill in the guerrilla war. When radio transmission became risky, the way Chick would travel rapidly from one district to another would be on horseback. But the skill-gathering phase and living the good life were about to come to an end.
The Japanese war machine, guided by a military imperialist government, had invaded China and seemed to be setting its sights on all of Asia.
We would see these young soldiers marching down Dewey Boulevard. We all knew that war was coming sometime, but certainly not for quite a while. And also, at a party one evening, General MacArthur told my in-laws, "You don't think I would keep my wife and child here if there was any danger."
Finally realizing that all-out war could be imminent, the United States recalled General MacArthur to active duty in 1941 and put him in command of all U.S. and Philippine troops. While movie audiences watched Sergeant York in Manila and Corregidor, and Japanese envoys negotiated a peace treaty in Washington, D.C., the Japanese Imperial Navy steamed across the Pacific Ocean toward Hawaii with plans to destroy the U.S. fleet in a single devastating air attack. Bad weather over Formosa prevented a nearly simultaneous attack on the Philippines, but about 10 hours after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese wreaked similar havoc on U.S. bases there too.
The night that we heard of Pearl Harbor, I got a phone call at my house from Admiral Hart's office at the Manila Hotel, and would I come immediately to the Manila Hotel. Admiral Hart was there, and several other of his staff wanted to verify that I was a reserve officer. He heard I was, and he wanted to know, and I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "You are on active duty right now." And he said, "I report to Captain Ports, Port Commander here, the representative of the Navy in the Custom House. He will take over as the commander of the Port of Manila, and you'll be his assistant." And he said, "The Navy will take over the entire fleet of the Luzon Stevedoring Company, the tugboats and lighters. All of us in the Philippines never could figure that the war would ever last 4 or 5 years. And we didn't expect that at that particular time that there'd be an attack on Manila in a few minutes."
By Christmas 1941, Manila had been abandoned by American and Filipino forces as General MacArthur declared it an open city. He then concentrated American and Filipino troops on the Bataan Peninsula along the northwestern portion of Manila Bay in an increasingly hopeless situation. They had no air support or protection, and relief could not be expected from the sea, where the Japanese had total control. MacArthur, who had set up headquarters on the island fortress of Corregidor, was ordered to Australia by President Roosevelt. On March 9, 1942, he decided to leave by PT boat, entrusting himself and his party to the hands of the daring Lieutenant John D. Bulkley.
In March, we got word that the boats were going to do a special job, and it turned out that that job was to get MacArthur off of Corregidor and go down to Mindanao where she'd get a B-17 out to Australia.
But I helped load General MacArthur up on a plane when he left for Australia, I wanted very much to hide back in that plane somewhere and go along.
The surrender of the troops on Bataan on April 9, 1942, was the beginning of one of the most horrible wartime experiences ever witnessed. The moving of some 60,000 Filipino and 10,000 American soldiers to prison camps was a cruel process that became known as the Bataan Death March. Prisoners were starved, denied water, beaten, bayoneted, and forced to suffer various forms of humiliation. Eventually, about 2/3 of these prisoners would die. With the fall of Corregidor on May 6th, the Japanese victory over the Phil-American forces was complete.
Well, I think we were all angry, bitter, and demoralized by the surrender. I know I was. It was a very hard thing to accept, the fact that our troops had surrendered. And I decided that I would had a better chance of survival and better food and everything if I didn't surrender.
We'd always had one demonstration. I had demonstrations on prison escape. And one of them, they tied the guys up out in front and broke their legs and left them tied up there for 3 days before they executed them.
Several thousand non-Filipino civilians were captured by the Japanese, rounded up and interned in various prison camps. Commander Parsons, who had already burned his Navy uniforms and assumed the role of the Panamanian consul to the Philippines, was eventually among those imprisoned, questioned, and tortured. People's fortunes had changed dramatically overnight.
This was the most unusual experience in the city, to be found that you were, after having worked like hell and come to a certain point in life that you thought you were fixed now and everything, and with my extra money coming in from molasses, and I had this Luzon stevedoring company. I was high on the hog, you might say, and really going along fine, and all of a sudden you've got nothing. Our children's savings account, the only pesos that we had.
After the city was declared an open city, the Philippine government that took over asked the Japanese to come in so that they would stop the bombing of the city. They came in, and I think that was approximately January the 1st.
Parsons, who had helped pay for his polo ponies by playing bridge and poker, was now playing for even higher stakes: his life.
His creativity was up for the challenge. He began by disguising his house as a diplomatic office.
I lived next door to President Quezon, Robert Street in Pasay, with a huge iron fence in front of it. And then I had a flagpole erected from my shipyard, and we put up the Panamanian flag there. And believe it or not, it was very successful.
Next, he put together a network of spies.
I had intelligence people all over Manila there who were pouring information in to the Jesuit fathers, and that was the start of it.
My father was telling me when I was still a young boy that his mission for Commander Parsons was to take note of the arrival and departure of Japanese naval vessels. My recollection of my father was he had very kind words for Commander Parsons.
Due to the integrity of Chick's relationship with his former employees, they were willing to report all Japanese military movements to their local priests, and Chick devised a way to get the information from them.
He came to the house, I think it must have been about 8 or 9 in the evening, dressed as a priest.
Well, you knew he spoke Spanish very well, and he passed himself off as a Spanish priest. And, you know, he was doing a lot of work for the American government.
Using these disguises, Chick gathered information and continued living almost like before the war.
I kept in touch with the Japanese through George Vargas, known as the Little President. Actually, we kept clear of all Japanese military for weeks. I knew that my neutral friends used to come over in the afternoons and we'd listen to the broadcast from San Francisco on shortwave as to what was happening in the war in Pearl Harbor and everything, and at the same time we'd have a cocktail party.
But all the information Chick had gathered was just piling up. He needed to get it to General MacArthur. His plan? He seemed to have convinced himself that he really was a Panamanian diplomat.
Parsons asked a neutral friend of his, Swedish consul Helga Jansen, to forward a request for him through the International Red Cross. Parsons was asking that Panama formally seek his repatriation out of Japanese hands by diplomatic means.
I said, well, hell, I'm going to try this myself. I've gotten by this far. Maybe I can get a little farther.
Parsons' efforts to get diplomatic consideration were being blocked in Manila, ironically enough, by Claude Buss, the American who had been left in charge of the High Commissioner's office.
On the day that Doolittle bombed Tokyo, Chick Parsons was taken to Fort Santiago for interrogation. And they were very brutal in their approach to questioning.
They declared war on us at that moment. They came in and took my father away, and my grandmother said, "You can't take him away. It's a mistake. He's a diplomatic representative of Panama. You can't do this." And they came up and just slugged her right across the side of the head, and down she went. And that's when I figured the war started, right there.
I didn't know what they'd found, but I wasn't going to admit to anything, because if, you know, I'd done so many things that if I admitted to one, then they'd take me out and hung me, I guess. So.
They still couldn't get any evidence on him. There was nothing to accuse him of. And so the diplomatic community was complaining that he was a neutral consul, that he was entitled to diplomatic immunity, which he really was. And so they finally released him to Santa Tomas.
He was able to smuggle out a letter to his wife in dirty laundry. It instructed her to destroy all the intelligence reports, as Japanese soldiers would certainly be searching their house. However, Katsy felt her husband's work was too important and kept it all in the attic of their house.
While Parsons spent the next 6 weeks at Santo Tomas, his unusual request for diplomatic treatment was forwarded to a puzzled Panama, who in turn gave it to the Philippine desk at the State Department in Washington, D.C. There, an old friend of Parsons looked it over and recommended immediate repatriation. In early June of 1942, Parsons and his family left Manila on the same Japanese ship that carried his American nemesis, Claude Buss.
Back in the U.S., Chick was finally able to deliver the intelligence reports he'd been hiding. The Philippine president in exile was also glad to see him.
President Quezon in Washington told people upon hearing of Parsons' arrival, "This is the happiest day of my life." And General MacArthur requested that Parsons volunteer to join him in Australia.
MacArthur found that I was there, and he had become completely frustrated on trying to get some way in contact with the Philippines and with the unsurrendered people and with the Filipino people. The Navy called me down one day and said, "MacArthur, here's his message." This is just before Christmas 1942. So I asked if they could give me just for my Christmas with my family, I'd be all right to go. And I went to Brisbane immediately. First thing he asked me, he said, "Would you volunteer to go back to the Philippines?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "You know, you don't have to."
After barely escaping with his life, Chick was headed back. But before he left Australia, he underwent an intensive commando training course.
He was too old to go back. He was in his early 40s. This was no job for a man that age.
Hiding in the many islands of the Philippines and organizing guerrilla activities to the best of their abilities were hundreds of American unsurrendered and escaped military men, as well as thousands of Filipino soldiers and civilians who found themselves in the same situation. A few of these resourceful men, like Prager, Peralta, the Fertig brothers, Nakar, and Cushing, were desperately trying to radio MacArthur's GHQ for recognition and aid.
But until Chick organized and validated their efforts, MacArthur had to consider that their communication could be a Japanese trick, and there was just too much to lose.
Commander Parsons knew most of these resistance fighters personally, and it was his intention to see that they were given what they needed to become valuable assets in MacArthur's plan to expel the Japanese from the country.
Chick Parsons traveled by submarine and would be dropped off at various places. Now, I think the first thing Chick Parsons did was to go around to various of the guerrilla commands and talk to a number of the guerrilla leaders.
Another thing that helped me get over the bitterness and the defeatism, I guess you'd call it, was the loyalty and the spirit of the Filipinos. And they weren't about to give up their country.
Among those unsurrendered were many radio operators. Parsons would parlay this fact into winning the cooperation of the Navy in providing submarines to be used on what came to be called special missions. He proposed setting up coast watcher stations in return for the use of submarines to resupply the Philippine guerrilla forces. The Navy agreed to lend Parsons and MacArthur the use of its submarines for their purposes, and the return to the Philippines began in earnest. This is Admiral, then Captain, Arthur McCollum telling his version.
We actually set up within the headquarters there of our own intelligence outfit, a special outfit we call the Philippine Resupply Section. Commander Parsons, who had been a businessman in Manila, headed up. He actually ran a sort of a warehousing operation. The general would want certain things developed up in the Philippines, and then he and Chick Parsons and so on would get their heads together to see how they could do it. And then we'd go ahead and see if we couldn't carry it out with these submarines. We repeatedly sent them in. And of course we had an amazing percentage of success.
Chick Parsons probably knew more about the Philippines than any other person, American or Filipino.
Chick would come aboard, and we had him aboard several times. His knowledge of the Mindanao saved us 3 or 4 times because the charts we had were very inaccurate. And if we got into some situation where we weren't exactly sure what our charts were at, we'd ask Chick, and he'd tell us where we could go, where the water was deep enough we could dive.
In February of 1943, the Navy put the submarine USS Tambor at Parsons' disposal for his first mission to the Philippines.
Chick's team had 4 members now, 2 Filipinos and Charlie Smith, a very seaworthy partner. Charlie had just escaped from the Japanese on Mindanao and sailed in an open boat to Australia, using only a map from an old National Geographic.
Parsons was about to learn that the most dangerous part of this and subsequent trips was the greeting he would receive from local guerrillas. He found them to be a shoot now, talk later kind of soldier.
I met Mr. Parsons the first time he landed in the Philippines on the 23rd of March, 1943. He was in a rubber boat. I arrived about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and when our beach patrol saw him, they fired at him. So our boys, 3 of them, stopped and let him in, especially when they heard Mr. Parsons called amigo, amigo. It means friend, we are friends.
One morning,
I remember it was a beautiful sunny morning. A young boy ran up to me and he says, "There's an Americano." He says, "all dressed up in nice new uniform."
Parsons had gone ashore to scout conditions and contact the guerrillas. The next evening he returned with them to unload the 5 tons of supplies on the submarine. His mission was just beginning.
It was just getting a little bit dark, and all of a sudden we could hear a rumble. You couldn't see where it was from, but you could hear it.
The conning tower broke the water, and there stood the most beautiful American flag that I ever saw.
They were a godsend because they brought in radios and guns and ammunition and everything that we needed, you know.
He and Smith were to evaluate and recognize Wendell Fertig as leader of the 10th Military District, set up Coast Watcher radio stations, meet as many guerrillas as possible, and appoint leaders among them, unifying their activities. Parsons also delivered 2 difficult messages from MacArthur. First, that the war was going to last a long time, and secondly, that guerrillas were to avoid direct attacks on the Japanese.
Once Chick got in direct contact, the locals understood he was there to help, and they provided support.
Father Haggerty at the time had 2 horses. One was Alibaba and the other was Sunny. And when Chick Parsons came over to his place, he gave Alibaba to Chick to use. That was his main transportation.
He established the fact that we were bringing aid to the Philippines. Every time the submarine came in, they brought in fresh American cigarettes, late issues of American magazines like Life magazine, and those pages of those magazines had dates on them. We would tear the pages out and distribute those and say, here's the aid, here's a magazine that was published just a month ago.
The guerrillas were not the only ones hiding from the Japanese. There were hundreds of civilians scattered around the islands praying for help.
And many of those prayers would be answered as they were picked up with the Japanese very close by Chick's submarine supply missions, now codenamed Spyron.
Late in 1943, the Navy assigned the world's 2 largest submarines to Parsons' group, the Narwhal and the Nautilus. These boats were given permission to pick up refugees.
We had a dual purpose, objective in visiting the Philippines, supplying the military, the guerrillas. The other activity is there were many Americans that were caught in the Philippines that were in hiding in the jungles, missionaries, teachers, nurses.
Their years of survival in the jungles of the Philippines were finally coming to an end.
We were in hiding from the Japanese. A few times, Filipinos would come and they would warn us, and then we would have to go and hide.
And we had heard that the submarines were coming in and going out, not really believing it till we saw a white Lucky Strike package and a new Life magazine.
The McKay family had had an evacuation place high up in the Agusan at a place called Gamoko. And I took one of the river launches up there and brought the family down.
We went down the Agusan River, past Butuan, out across the bay to Nisipit in daylight. And I think the parents were kind of shell-shocked, but I thought it was great.
It was way more dangerous doing what we were doing than any war patrol with whoever heard of a submarine without torpedo tubes. We were awkward, we were noisy, we were slow, we were terribly, terribly old.
Now they were pulling into tiny Nisipit Harbor in Japanese-held territory in North Mindanao to unload 75 tons of material for the guerrillas and pick up 33 civilians. Their pilot, who had run them aground earlier, finally brought them alongside an old lumberyard dock.
My father was pretty uneasy at having such a concentration of Americans, and the Japanese were rumored to be 6 air miles away. sun was going down, and we heard this enormous engine, which could only mean that the submarine had emerged. So we ran up to the top of the hills and we went over, and she was just there with the water coming off her deck. And the sunset and the sky was golden and the sea was golden, and this big black ship.
We pulled up the river, swung around and tied up to the dock. And we did. They met us at the dock with a keg of tuba beer, and the band put on a show for us while we was unloading.
In walks this man that my father had known before the war, I think very well. And he was the healthiest, strongest, vital guy, and he had a whitest shirt I'd seen in 2 years, and pressed khaki pants, and probably Navy issue shoes, but they weren't worn out, and it was Chick Parsons. And I guess about midnight they offloaded, and they said we could get on. And we went up the ladder and down in the conning tower, and they put us in the forward torpedo room. The bunks were all made up. I guess somebody'd had that duty after they got all the cargo out. We're put to bed right on top of the torpedoes. And I met one of the sailors who was on that voyage. They were the last two down the conning tower, and the band was still there, and they said, "Can you play St. Louis Woman?" And as we went down the slip and out to sea, they were playing St. Louis Woman.
Eventually, Coast Watcher radio stations were established on all the major islands. They proved their value to the Navy over and over again, providing hundreds of targets for the submarine force patrolling the surrounding sea lanes. By October 1944, the time of the great invasion of Leyte, there were some 300,000 guerrillas placed throughout the Philippines, most of them armed with weapons brought in by submarines. They were ready to join the big show. On October 11th, 9 days before the scheduled invasion, Commander Parsons was dropped onto the darkening waters of Leyte Gulf in a small rubber boat by a Black Cat PBY. Parsons' top-secret mission was to acquire and transmit to MacArthur's GHQ information on Japanese troop strength and location, as well as reports on the terrain and weather conditions. He was also ordered to move civilian population away from areas targeted for intensive bombing. Parsons himself added another item, to try and redirect American bombardment away from the areas where he could not evacuate civilians, like the town of Tacloban. Meanwhile, the invasion fleet of 700 ships and 300,000 troops waited for messages that began, "Parsons sends." The information they received enabled the Americans to land nearly unmolested and spared thousands of civilian lives. The subsequent conquest of Leyte and the rest of the Philippines was a major step in MacArthur's march to Japan. The destroyer USS Hale, cruising just offshore at the southern end of the invasion beach, spotted a flashing light coming from the enemy-held area. The message was, "Can you send a boat for Parsons?"
Chick was dropped off and later picked up regularly. During any one of these, a single mistake could easily cost him his life. One night, he was rowing his rubber boat ashore in Palawan Bay. The guerrillas had been radioed that he was coming. In the darkness, he spotted a familiar sight.
He was paddling toward the beach where the guerrillas were waiting for him, and he came across a boat that he had already been using, and as he awoke the sleeping crew, he found out that it was crawling with Japanese. One of them grabbed him, cut his throat open with a sharp knife, and the two of them went into the water together. My dad holding onto his throat to hold it together, and he was able to struggle free from the Japanese soldier. When he came up, he found the Japanese shooting at him. The guerrillas were shooting at the Japanese. bullets were falling all around him, and he swam underwater as much as he could. He finally made it to shore. The guerrillas put him in the hands of an old woman who spat guava leaf juice into his neck and sewed him up with some twine. The first aid given to him on the shore probably saved his life.
Parsons, however, was not to be given a rest. Instead, he and his guerrillas were put to a test by fire. For the first time, guerrillas were being asked to take offensive action against Japanese. General Kruger had a couple of missions for Parsons. The elimination of the two remaining Japanese outposts in southern Leyte at Malitbag and Maasin, two small coastal towns. On October 23rd and 24th, assisted by an LCS gunboat on loan from Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet, the shore-based guerrillas eliminated all Japanese in both locations with no losses of their own. It was the first time Parsons had taken command of a ship. The gunboat came to Malitbag and fired upon the garrison here near the beach, but also at the Japanese occupying Casa Escaño, the family house farther inland. The Japanese fled into the nearby mountains and forests, but we guerrillas were waiting for them.
We were on top of the hill looking down the place there where the shelling took place. And the Japanese ran.
My father rode out in an outrigger canoe and went to the boat and asked those people, the Americans, not to hit this house.
Exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the two gunboats has been sighted because they know already the place where the soldiers are, and all the rest here in Masin is already surrounded by the army, guerrillas.
Nine o'clock the following day, I came down and see the garrison. What I saw are the dead Japanese, and there was no more gunboat, no more petty boat on the shore.
The successful mopping up of the Japanese troops in the two coastal towns was over on the afternoon of October 24th, and Commander Parsons, feverish and weak from malaria, hitched a ride with PT boat friends. It was bad timing. Instead of a speedy return to medical care in Tacloban, he had a front row seat for the Battle of Surigao Strait.
We had a number of people who we would let off and pick up later, but we also had a number that would ride with us. Sometimes we wouldn't even know their name, they just happened to be there. Word came that there was a fleet coming up heading into a place called Surigao Strait. That's where the PTs were positioned, and it was a rainy, dark night, just a miserable night. But we could hear what was happening. The PTs from the south were reporting the movement of the Japanese fleet, and some of them were taking them under fire and so on. So all the way they could hear them coming up there, and there we were right in the middle of this, and all of a sudden there they were.
The reports from the lead PT boats allowed Admiral Jesse Oldendorf to line up his battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in a textbook T formation at the northern portion of the straits, from which vantage point they decimated the oncoming Japanese fleet.
And then we saw the most beautiful fireworks display that we've ever seen. It was 4th of July times 1,000.
As it turned out, Parsons was on one of the few boats to receive hits, and he himself received a concussion. Submariner Parsons, much the worse for his adventure on surface craft, was eventually returned to the United States.
But Chick's war was far from over. His health was restored after 2 months, and he returned to battle in the Philippines.
Parsons persuaded Admiral Kinkaid to assign him 4 vessels, 2 LCIs that could carry troops and supplies from one island to another, and 2 LCSs capable of supporting amphibian landings with rockets, cannons, and machine guns. The guerrillas had their own fleet now. Furthermore, it was an official part of Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet, with the designation Task Group 70.4, under the command of Captain Al Eldridge on the LCS-10. Parsons, as a sort of commodore of the fleet, would accompany these boats, especially on their early missions. I was assigned to one of the 4 gunboats that attacked the Japanese garrison at Talisayan. I pointed out the location of the Japanese and their fuel storage tanks. There were big explosions on the shore and smoke that went up very high. Each of the boats had 2 scouts with them. We boarded at Camiguin. The raid was very successful. The Japanese did not return there.
At the end of the Talisayan raid, they wired back to me and wanted to know how many Japs we'd killed, and I wired back 132. And I got a radiogram back that says, "We don't believe it." I said, "Which ear do you want, the left ear or the right ear? Please advise."
As successful as Commander Parsons had been in his work with guerrillas, he was handed a tragic setback in Manila, where his intelligence group was virtually eliminated by the Japanese, acting on information provided by a Filipino agent, Franco Vera Reyes. Many of the net were rounded up in early 1944 and beheaded in August. Parsons' mother-in-law, Blanche Jerica, was included in this execution, and many of Parsons' best friends.
My father was in charge of all the intelligence. He was the second batch that was picked up.
The Japanese had been planning a big roundup for many months. They got on Chick Parsons' trail in April of 1943.
This group were sometimes too daring, I think, because they would get together. I understand again from stories at the Hayalay. They would have a private room there and they would talk, they get to drinking. Sometimes they get to drinking, somebody played the piano and played God Bless America. And here are Japanese officers playing, betting on the Hayalay.
They dug up the hole, and that's where all 30 of them were there. The heads were on one side, the bodies were on the other. It was, it's something I would like to forget, let's put it that way.
My grandmother was a suspect person by the Japanese because of her relationship to my father. The Japanese were really mad. They had had my father in jail, they let him go, and now he was back in the Philippines, tormenting the hell out of them, and he would do for the rest of the war.
The final liberation of Manila was horrific. The Japanese decided to defend it to the last man. After a month of fighting, 2,000 American soldiers and 10,000 Japanese were dead. But the real casualty was Manila itself. 100,000 civilians died during that month. The city, once known as the Pearl of the Orient, was systematically destroyed.
Massive fires are started. In the south part of Manila, trucks go around throwing gasoline on the walls of houses and setting them aflame. And then the massacres take place a few days after this. So it couldn't have been troops running amok because it's so organized. It happens in so orderly a fashion.
Parsons' work with guerrillas was coming to an end, though his gunboats continued to wreak havoc amongst Japanese coastal outposts.
Chick's role was changing. The Filipinos were eager to rebuild their lives, and he threw himself into that process.
He knew intimately the society in a way that none of the Washington-based leadership knew the society. They arrived, and this was terra incognita. Chick and MacArthur They knew the place.
Amazingly, he seemed to hold no grudge against the Japanese. Working with them, he became one of the most successful businessmen in Asia.
Dad was very busy rebuilding his, helping rebuild the company, the Luzon Stevedoring Company, which had, like every other company out here, been totally demolished. I think he was up in Tokyo 5 minutes after the war was over trying to get his Japanese friends out of jail so he could start trading molasses again.
He supported Japanese athletes entering international competition when they were being shunned.
Chick Parsons went to General Headquarters and was able to request permission from General MacArthur.
He was the first baseball commissioner of Asia when the Philippines was the first champion, baseball champion in Asia. He was the father of Philippine baseball.
And on top of that, he was working with President Rojas on a number of items. I don't know where he got the energy. He had more energy than 10 people.
He said nothing counted as much as luck, but he made his own luck with the way he treated people. In the beginning of the war, the night before his family's daring escape from Manila, there was a knock at the door. It was Pete Yamanuchi, a man who knew all about Chick. He had a new job. He was now an officer in the Japanese Navy. Chick invited him in. The two men went into a room where they drank beer and talked for hours. When they came out, Pete wished him luck and left. Chick had reason to be nervous the next day, as he and his family waited to board the Japanese ship to freedom. He had every intelligence report he had gathered stuffed into his baby's diaper bag. But the Japanese had no respect for diplomatic immunity and began searching everything. Chick handed the diaper bag to his 5-year-old son, and it was the only bag that wasn't searched. Was it true that nothing counted as much as luck? Courage probably helped. Chick was a true hero, possessed of an old-world gallantry and bravado.
He's very calm, but very sharp-eyed. That's all. What we call it in English a so silent man.
General Douglas MacArthur, the most successful general in World War II, told General Romulo, "Chick Parsons is the bravest man I know."
I hate to see that evening sun go down, but I hate to see that evening sun go down, 'cause my baby, she done left this town. If I feel tomorrow like I feel today, if I feel tomorrow like I feel today, I'll pack my bags and make a getaway. Say, do it, woman, with your diamond ring. You used to lead me around by your apron strings. If it wasn't for the powder and the store-bought hair, you evil woman, you couldn't get nowhere. I love my baby like a schoolboy loves his pie, like a Kentucky colonel who loves his rocker and rye. I love my baby until the day I die. got to sing.